Hi everyone. My name's Andrew Ward or Wardy from Regen Farmers Mutual. Welcome to the Open Woodlands Restoration co-design session 3. This one is on the benefits of productivity from Open Woodlands Restoration. And we're calling this one, How Do We Tell Our Story? So this is the third co-design session. Our first co-design session was on what do we have, and we looked at the environmental benefits of box gum grassy woodlands, and that led to the creation of the farm snapshot, which gave farmers the ability to draw where their farm is and submit that polygon, and then 24 hours later, they'd receive a farm level feasibility outlining their biodiversity condition score and the carbon abatement and eligible areas or ineligible areas for carbon projects or for box gum restoration. And so the second co-design session was called What Is It Worth? And we looked then at the financial benefits of uh, open woodland restoration under a carbon methodology, the future of biodiversity payments, the opportunity to stack benefits, etc. And today, the third of these is called How Do We Tell Our Story? And it looks at the productivity benefits of open woodland restoration. And so I'd like to welcome a few key contributors for us today. Um, all of us are going to be contributing. That's the nature of co-design. So our intent is that we all try to do our best. The intent is that you get an opportunity to talk. Like we're going to get some expert input initially, but the bottom hour of this event will be you guys interacting and actually changing and help shaping exactly how we tell our story. Um, there is the opportunity when you're co-designing to forget that others are trying to do their best. We ask you to respect your fellow co-designers. And, these things work best when they're timed and there's a bit of creative urgency required for that. And although it could be cool to talk about all sorts of topics whilst we're together, this is about, in this case, the productivity benefits of open woodland restoration. In the room today, we're going to hear from Sue Ogilvie, uh, David Smith, and James Dyack, and my fellow facilitator, Rowan Clark, at various times. But we're particularly interested in who else is in the room and your experiences. And what we'd like, before we dive into the content, is for you to pull out your phones if you can, or to click on the link, which I'll now share with you in the chat. And what we're doing is a survey of who's in the room. And the idea there, of course, is that we're measuring how people respond in these co-design sessions across 5 different channels. So local media, elders, Landcare, New South Wales Farmers Association, Tablelands Farming Systems Group have all been testing social benefit call to action, environmental benefit call to action, financial benefit call to action, and productivity benefit call to action. Today we're at the productivity benefits call to action, and it would help us to understand who's here, what motivated them to be here, how did they hear about the Open Woodland Restoration Project, and what would they like to get out of this co-design session? So if you could, in the chat, you should now see a link, and hopefully you can fill in that link and start submitting. I'll give us till 12:37, so 3 minutes to finish the survey. If anyone wants, I'll put it up on screen again so you can use the QR code to quickly get there. Oh, we can see some of the responses are starting to get in. Welcome to everybody who's just coming in. I've only got 6 participants who've submitted, so I assume a lot of you are still submitting. If you need that link again, just let me know. Perfect. All right, guys, well done. So we're going to be talking about open woodland restoration. Now, we believe that there's a sweet spot between 20 and 30% canopy cover where there's not too few trees and not too many trees, and that goes against the conventional model, which would have you believe that trees and grasses are competing per 100 mils of moisture, which leads logically to the conclusion that if you're looking for productivity, you want 100% cleared land. So we're of the belief that actually you can restore that overcleared land by planting according to a design with a tram track, large gap tram track, large gap tram track, and that by direct seeding in that design at a microclimate level, the right sort of plants will emerge, eucalypts and wattles, etc., and will restore simultaneously forest cover, which is 2 meters tall and 20% canopy cover, which makes it eligible for carbon, and restore the native boxgum grassy woodlands ecology, with the aim being that most of that is actually grasslands, even though it's called boxgum grassy woodlands, and it is suitable for grazing and productive agriculture, which gives land the opportunity to receive a productivity benefit, a carbon benefit, and a biodiversity and habitat benefit at that sweet spot. And so to help us understand that sweet spot today, we've asked Dave Smith from ANU to come and share some of his understanding of boxgum grassy woodlands with us. And then following David, we're going to hear from Dr. Sue Ogilvie from Farming for the Future, who will talk about how trees in the landscape affect financial outcomes. So, David, thank you and welcome. You might have to unmute if you're talking.
Can you see my screen all right there, everyone?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Wardy. Hi, everyone. My name's Dave Smith, and I'm an ecologist at the Australian National University working on the Sustainable Farms project. So today I've got a very short talk, just giving a little bit of context around boxgum grassy woodlands and sort of focusing on the importance of revegetation within those systems. So boxgum grassy woodlands, you can see there's a map here. Boxgum occurs kind of on the western side of the divide, all the way from Victoria to southern Queensland. So this area overlaps very strongly with very productive agricultural land. And as Wardy has already alluded to, these areas have been very heavily cleared. To the point where less than 10% of the original boxgum grassy woodland remains. And what we do have is often in very poor condition, heavily degraded and wouldn't be considered to be an intact woodland. So we now consider these woodlands to be critically endangered, and they support over 50 threatened species of plants and animals within these woodlands. So really, really important systems that are in need of recovery. So the vast majority of remaining boxgum occurs on private land. So there's great opportunities there for farmers to get involved in woodland restoration. And we've seen lots of really good examples of farmers doing great work in that space. So a little bit of background for our group. So we're an ecological research group primarily, and we've been doing wildlife surveys on farms for over 25 years now, across lots of different farms and over 800 sites across our project area that you might have noticed on a few slides ago. So today I'll focus a little bit around birds, and so these are some of the threatened and declining woodland birds that call the boxgum grassy woodlands home. And we're so fortunate to have such incredible wildlife in Australia and wildlife in our paddocks when we're farming in these woodlands. And we know that one of the most important thing, or probably the most important thing for restoring bird communities, is revegetation. So obviously huge loss of veg cover across these landscapes. And when we actually compare some of the different conservation actions that have been undertaken, we learn that revegetation really is the number one way of bringing back species into these landscapes. So when we compare it to things like protecting and enhancing remnant vegetation, for example, reducing grazing pressure, controlling noisy miners, we're seeing big benefits from re-veg work. And another thing we know is in landscapes that have low vegetation cover, if we're able to double that amount of cover, we can double the number of bird species at the farm level, and we can triple the number of bird species at the landscape level. So really big gains, and I suppose it's a good news story really in terms of boxgum conservation, is that we know some of the things that we need to do to be able to recover these species and restore function to these landscapes. So plantings can occur in many different ways, including the stuff that you guys are talking about here today. So plantings provide value to biodiversity in lots of different ways. So firstly, just as habitat that wasn't previously there, allows things to occupy new sites to improve connectivity in fragmented landscapes. We know that plantings offer habitat that often doesn't exist in a landscape outside of re-veg. So, there are species that we consider to be planting specialists, and often these are declining species like speckled warblers. So, we really do need this kind of regrowth vegetation and revegetation in landscapes to support the entire suite of woodland birds. Another thing that they provide is structural diversity. So in a lot of really intensively farmed landscapes, it's actually quite difficult to find mid-story and understory outside of planted vegetation. So while we know that we've had really big declines, obviously in big old trees and remnant cover, it can be quite rare to find understory and mid-story vegetation. And that's exactly what we get relatively quickly through restoration plantings. And we also know that the plantings are really important drought refuges for lots of different birds, and particularly some of the small birds of conservation concern. But it's not all about biodiversity, of course, and I think some of the other speakers will talk a little bit more about this. There's so many good reasons to be doing revegetation work on farms, including, for shelter for livestock is so important as refuges for pollinators and predators of agricultural pests. They can be really important carbon storage areas. Revegetation can be great ways of protecting sensitive areas as well. So riparian areas or even farm dams. And of course, we know that revegetation is really widely used for erosion control as well. And I'll leave it there. Thank you. Happy to take questions, Wardy, or do you want to do that later?
Well, David, I think you've got to leave by 1, so maybe I will ask for, but if we could keep it to 5 minutes of questions so we can get Sue the opportunity to be on by 10 to 1, that'd be great. I'm making the assumptions here that people are familiar with box gum grassy woodlands, but perhaps there aren't people in the audience. Uh, any questions from the floor? I have a bit of a silly one. Why is it when it's boxgum grassy woodlands, people focus on the trees instead of the grassy woodlands, which is 20 to, which is 70 to 80% of it. And the thing that makes it a threatened ecological community is the grassland species, not necessarily the tree species. Can you talk to maybe that ecological bias as opposed to how come we're not focused on the native grasses? Yeah.
It's an interesting question. It's probably just a matter of perception. I think what do you like, it's a really obvious thing, I suppose, when you see a landscape that's denuded of trees and we know, the sort of spacing and the sort of cover that we used to have. Maybe if you don't have that kind of ecological eye, it's a bit more difficult to kind of notice a grassland that looks nothing like it might have looked before it was improved, like pasture improvement. Um, yeah, I suspect that's what it is. And yeah, like maybe it's also that people, when they think of the bush, don't necessarily think of open woodlands. Maybe they sort of think of forests, and think that that's what things were supposed to look like. Whereas, it's a very different situation in the temperate woodlands, and we know that those open systems are what's required in these places.
We might just talk to the ecological health and the carbon market question there. So, a lo- uh, some of the woodlands ecologists that I've spoken to say that, what you'd need is the bigger, more mature trees that develop hollows, but that they take time. But ideally, they're sort of 50 stems to the hectare, whereas, say, the stems that you need when they're new and maturing trees are like 200 stems to a hectare to get the level of requirement for the CER. Do you see natural thinning from 200 stems down to 50 stems, or how does that transpire? Or are we just creating second level quality box gum grassy woodlands compared to first level quality box gum grassy woodlands when we've got really high stem densities or higher than ideal stem densities? Yeah.
Like natural thinning is a thing. It happens, but also, I think we have to remember that we're dealing with highly modified landscapes where natural processes aren't necessarily always functioning. And so I think, there are times where intervention is important. And so, we see, in a remnant woodland, for example, that's had no grazing pressure. Often you'll see really, really dense regeneration. So species like Blakely's red gum are a really good example of it. You can see very, very dense regeneration of Blakely's red gum. And actually, you know, there's not much there to kind of to thin that. And so mechanical thinning, I think, can be a really good thing. There's been a few different studies that have showed actually, you can get biodiversity benefits from doing that. So yes, I think it's important to make sure that we have, yeah, not overly vegetated landscapes. Yeah.
I think but to summarize that, there's too many trees is a problem and too few trees is a problem. It's Goldilocks, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, David. I'm going to give the mic to Sue. Sue, are you able to share screen and come off mute?
I am, and thank you very much. Thank you, David, for that excellent presentation. So I'm the Program Director of Farming for the Future, and Farming for the Future has been researching some of these questions about whether or not, as Wardy spoke about in the introduction, we think that there's a Goldilocks zone of trees and grass and grassy woodlands on livestock farms. But until our program, to our knowledge anyway, nobody had ever got the data to actually understand whether those theorised productivity benefits were actually experienced by farms. And so our program was able to research that question. And I'm very pleased to say that the hypothesis was borne out. Grassy woodlands really are good for productivity. And I'll just share a little bit about that with you now. So when we think about ecosystems on a farm, and I'll just share my screen, we think about all of the different ecosystem types you would expect to see on a farm. So a few of you will have already seen our possibly quite famous cartoon series here. And we're just pointing out that when we think about the natural resources that underpin a farm, when we think about natural capital, it's not a particularly new thing. It's not a particularly scary term. It's all of the things that you would expect to see on a farm, including the grassy woodlands that you can graze very effectively and sensitively with livestock and have really quite good synergy. So our research program was able to study the question of whether the grassy woodlandness of a property was associated with better financial performance. And we collected a whole lot of data from more than 130 farms throughout these regions of Australia. And we analysed the data to find the relationships between the natural capital of a farm and the farm performance. And we looked at several different aspects of natural capital, some of which James will talk about in a little while, and some of which David and Wardy have already mentioned. So we measured whether the farm had a good capacity to provide shade and shelter for livestock. We measured whether the farm had a good capacity to provide habitat for predators of crop and pasture pests. And we also measured whether the farm retained a lot of its original grassy woodland characteristics. And then we analysed that against 5 years' worth of farm financial and production performance. And there are plenty of resources available on our website, but we found that there were several really positive associations between different types of natural capital on a farm and the farm business performance. And so these are some of them here, and I'll drill into ecological condition actually. What we did find was that there was a positive relationship between the degree to which the trees are integrated throughout the farm. So what we found was trees where you could see lots of trees distributed quite equally throughout the property were associated with farm businesses that had greater gross margin in their livestock enterprises. We certainly found relationships between ground cover and profit, as you would expect. But the most surprising relationship for us, well, me personally, maybe because I'm not an ecologist, was that we saw this really strong, statistically significant relationship between the degree of grassy woodlandness of a property and the resilience of the farm financial position. So what we found was that the more of the grassy woodland characteristics, wide-spaced, large eucalypt trees, rich understory, the more of those characteristics that still remained throughout the farm was associated with the farm businesses that had a much more stable financial performance. And when we look at that in detail for the New South Wales region in particular, and this is an example of a farm that's at pretty high ecological condition already. And the research is saying that in New South Wales for livestock producers, that the more grassy woodland characteristics you have on your property, the more financially resilient the businesses tended to be. And I speculate, and it'd be very interesting for David and James to talk about this further. I think that probably what that means is that the shade and shelter services and habitat services provided by the trees and the native understory is really important to providing that buffer for production. And the diversity of forages and also the protection for against the crop and pasture pests that the grassy woodlands produce. So I'm very excited to see Regen Farmers Mutual exploring this topic in more detail and actively starting to work on restoring grassy woodlands, because I think while their work is going to focus on particular areas of the property, I think the benefits might extend more broadly than just to the project area and might be experienced over the farm in total. Be happy to take any questions.
And so I think we have the benefit of you for the whole of the co-design. Is that correct? Because I think we don't want you just to be silent from this point forward. So anybody with questions for Farming for the Future, please ask them now. Otherwise, we will call on Sue during the co-design to give opinions. Expert views, we'll call them, instead of opinions. Any questions about Farming for the Future? All right, James, are you able to drive that slide deck, mate?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just see how I go here. Are you all seeing that now?
Yep.
Great. So broadly, for the purposes of this little talk I'm going to give, we can think of the types of influence on the products that we're producing in livestock systems as having two forms. One is the direct impacts on the animal, how the animal behaves in the landscape, how it benefits from things like shade and shelter. And the other types of impacts, we can think of them as about the way that the landscape is functioning, and particularly the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, and some of those things that when we, people who think about how landscapes work, stand in the landscape that we might tend to see. And unfortunately, or fortunately, there's strong data about the way the livestock benefit directly, so how they respond to shade and shelter, but there's less strong data about some of the landscape function aspects, nutrient cycling, the benefit of diverse types of feed, and particularly the small water cycle and the way water moves in the landscape. We have good understanding of that as a theory, but we don't have great data saying this is why these livestock are performing better or worse. So what I'm going to talk about on the next couple of slides is the information that we have stronger data about. And when it comes to heat performance, we can see here there's the heat load risk category. So the higher the shade level, the higher the heat impact on livestock, and the higher the impacts on their metabolism. So just by providing some shade in a paddock where the livestock can access 60 to 70% shade, we can see a substantial decline in the heat load, the extent to which that animal is pushed outside of its preferred metabolic environment that's there. Now, as Vorty said, we don't need to have 60 to 70% cover over the entire paddock for the animals to have access to 60 to 70% shade. And anytime you drive through the landscape and you look at how on a hot day, particularly in the middle of the day during summer, and you look at what livestock are doing, you can see that if there's shade, they'll be under that shade. We've probably all seen on the internet the picture of sheep sheltering under these solar panels. So we know intrinsically that if we're out in the landscape ourselves, we want to be underneath the shade. So there's the heat load aspect. And then an important factor for people in the landscape, animals in the landscape, is wind, particularly in the southern tablelands, but also in the northern tablelands. Wind affects the temperature quite substantially, and we have got quite a few shelter belts that have been built in the last 2-3 decades, possibly even longer. And often what you see with those shelter belts is that they are 10 or 20 metres wide, and they're quite thick, quite high stem density. So you see something that looks like the picture on the right, where there's not much porosity. And what tends to happen with a shelter belt like that is it tends to behave a bit more like a wall, where there's actually quite a lot of buffeting and turbulence on the downwind side from that shelter belt. Whereas if you have a shelter belt, it's a bit counterintuitive with more porosity, where the trees are not quite so tightly packed, where the wind can get through a little bit, you actually tend to find lower wind speed on the downwind side of that type of shelter belt. And there's quite good evidence for this. There's quite good data about it, because we've got lots of shelter belts and people have been out there with measurements measuring the wind speed. So that is something which applies directly to the open woodland restoration design, where we're not seeking to put dense shelter belts back into paddocks. We're seeking to put a whole of paddock treatment which has actually got greater porosity. And the windbreak impact is quite significant in cold weather, because we've all, I guess, felt it when your skin is wet and the wind picks up. You feel the cold quite substantially. If you've ever been listening to the weather forecast and you've heard the Bureau of Meteorology or another agency refer to the sheep grazier's warning, what they're actually talking about is the Nixon-Smith chill index, devised by the scientist Nixon-Smith, and it looks at the impact on a lamb. It looks at 400-meter height wind speed. So how high is it at the height of a lamb? And how much rain has fallen, i.e. how wet is that lamb likely to be? Now, I've got two charts here, one showing the dry conditions and one showing the wet conditions. In the dry conditions, on the left, we're looking at 35 kilometers an hour and 5 kilometers an hour at 8 degrees Celsius, with the expectation that in our sheltered environment, we've got just 5 kilometers an hour, and we're below that sheep grazier's warning threshold of 1,000 points on the Nixon-Smith chill index. Now, on the wet conditions, we're looking at 12 degrees rather than 8. Both of these are quite representative temperatures for the southern tablelands during lambing or calving. And 12 degrees at 35 kilometers an hour when there's been 10 millimeters of rain in the last 24 hours. So not a heap of rain, but some rain, which many people might be welcome for, but also meaning a lot of people are thinking, where are my livestock? And if you're in an open woodland restoration style paddock or another paddock with shelter, where your wind speed is just 5 kilometers an hour at 12 degrees, you're still on the other side of that operational warning at 1,000, but the Nixon-Smith chilling index is just 1,049 compared to 1,217, which is a severe rating, and that's at 12 degrees. Now, many times you might have a bit of rain and temperatures much lower than 12 degrees, depending on what your altitude is. So those wind breaks and the extent to which they actually slow down wind rather than create turbulence and perhaps don't slow the wind down as much as we might expect can make a big difference. And finally, bringing it together, when we think about how much of the energy that livestock are consuming is actually able to be devoted to their metabolic functions, to gaining weight, to feeding a calf or feeding a lamb, we see in the thermal neutral zone in the middle there, that's when they've got the maximum amount of energy for production. Once you get into heat stress, you can see quite quickly that animal performance declines. And then also in cold stress, you can see with the feed intake there, animals are actually able to keep consuming, where when it gets quite hot, they become less and less able to actually eat. But that, of course, is dependent on there being feed available. But you can see that the maintenance energy requirement rises quite quickly in cold conditions as well. So this has been a short summary of the data that we have. personally, I'm very interested in landscape function, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But hopefully, we'll be able to collect more data about how broader landscape functions are working in the future in the way that they contribute to livestock production outcomes.
James, that was great. Thank you very much. We might just stop sharing for a second and go to the sort of gallery view and take some questions from the floor about Open Woodlands restoration.
Can I invite you to force that, Wardy? I always find it hard to
mate,
find.
not a problem.
Thank you.
All right. Any questions for, I think Dave has had to go, but we should have Sue and we've got James still. So any questions from the floor for any of our speakers? Does it all ring true from you, Hansi, in your experience, what we've just heard in terms of financial performance, in terms of shade and shelter? Is that what you've experienced? Could you please come off mute? You're on mute. Hansi, you're on mute if you just want to.
Here we go.
Down in the bottom left.
Sorry, absolutely correct. I have absolutely no doubt about it. And we started a long time ago here at Bookham, and it was within 3 years to 4 years that we noticed a difference, that we found our bottom line was much better. And it's mainly through the grasses more than anything. Those native grasses are brilliant for wool productions, and they just keep growing with the littlest amount of rain. Even with a dew, you'll find it continues to grow until you get the frost that stops it. So we have no doubt at all. Find it difficult to understand why other people can't see it.
There's this, we prefer to see what we prefer to be true, or we prefer what to be true, what we prefer to see. One of those things.
As a woman, I'm sounding sexist now. As a woman, I think it's more to do with ego and numbers. You've got to be seen to have big numbers, and that's your status.
But it looks to be more productive to have trees. Do you mean big numbers on the side of your?
Well, big numbers on your stock.
Right.
The fact that we can make as much money, more money with running 3,000 sheep well than 5,000 sheep not well, doesn't give you that ego boost. But that's just my personal opinion amongst the cocky people that are around. I'm sure that's why they're called cockies.
We might ask for, I've got Johan Nissen and Doug, all with comments in the chat. Do you want to bring them out and talk to those? Johan, Doug? No, everyone can read them. So I have a question, and James, you or somebody more scientific than me. Hansi just mentioned, dew points and the low requirement for native species grasses. Do we know what the function of trees in collecting dew and mists in the landscape and that small water cycle on a daily basis, how trees impact effective rainfall, effective moisture? Are you familiar with any research in that area?
Wardy, I think the concepts are fairly well understood, but in terms of there actually being data of a sufficiently long time frame, that's where it starts to fall down, because the cost for the types of weather stations to measure, say, things like relative humidity has just started to come down now. But if you imagine that one where you've got more trees, you're going to have lower levels of wind, so you're less likely to have the humidity, the vapor pressure in the air how much water is actually in the air, you're less likely to have that pushed away by the wind, but also with the more variety of plants photosynthesizing and photosynthesizing at different heights in the landscape, different canopy levels, so shrubs and trees, and at sort of the grass height. What each plant is doing when it's photosynthesizing is actually exhaling water vapor, and that's helping to cycle that water and increase the humidity in the landscape. Now, if it's windy and it's pushed off, that's probably lost from the landscape. But if it's not windy, then that cycling of water, that increasing the vapor pressure, then it starts to fall down as dew. That's what we see as dew. Now that we've got the weather stations that can measure that are much cheaper, maybe we'll have some more of that data, but we don't have a good data set at the moment.
Thank you, James. That was helpful for me. Any other well, apart from my own questions, I'm finding interesting, please. Any questions from the floor?
I have one for Sue, Wardy.
Please.
So you were talking about gross margin there in your presentation. I'm just wondering, when you were talking with your farmers, they're probably not quite representative farmers, but interesting farmers to be talking with. What was the discussion like when they were thinking about how successful their farming operations were, in terms of whether they were talking about margin or about yield? And how do you think that plays out in this type of, when we're thinking about this?
Yeah, good question, James. So obviously there's been a variety of responses to the research and regional differences. With respect to whether our farms are representative of farms in the district, we have been able to test and confirm that the selection of our farms does represent family farms at all of the different levels of natural capital that we see in the landscape. When we also ran a wellbeing survey over them as well. We did find that from a wellbeing perspective, our farmers were biased towards a more well set, which I think would make sense given that they had the time and capacity to participate in the survey. So I think that makes sense. From a natural capital perspective, we have confirmed that they are representative. When we talked to them about because we did a lot of design up front for what should be the right financial indicators to look at. And we not only got farmers involved, but we got farm accountants and farm consultants involved, including some of the large farm business benchmarking service providers. And we focused on gross margin, we focused on EBIT. We also studied productivity from a technical perspective, but it was financial resilience and profit that were the drivers of profit that were of the most interest. And yields really did not come up as being relevant at all. Although I have to say some of the more intense farmers in the sample are very focused on running lots of sheep, for example, per hectare. And for some of them, it's been a little bit of a disappointment to see that that's not necessarily strongly associated with better profit. So there was a few shocks and surprises for some farmers, a few delights for those farmers who could see that they hadn't optimised their operations already and are making the best use of natural capital that was possible to make. So a diversity of responses.
Thanks.
Anybody
else? Doug here. I was wondering if I can expand on that question I've got in chats regarding the shelter belts. Being an ex-ocean racer, I was always under the impression that when you've got high pressure or pressure of wind hitting the windward side of your sail, you create a vacuum or a turbulence on the lower side, or a low pressure system there, which creates a milder, more, well, it gives a boat push forward. But I would have thought that if that would also extrapolate into your shelter belts, where you have your tree height and you have your shrubbery down below, which would also slow down the wind that goes, or block the wind that goes through, and create a low pressure system on the leeward side of the trees, thus creating a more sheltered area in there and retaining some of that moisture, etc. How does that work?
James, I'll ask you to take that.
Doug, I think what's happening is that when the wind is crossing over the top of the shelter belt, if you imagine we'll call it a wall, right? We've got a very dense shelter belt. Then as it comes over the edge of the wall, and there is a low pressure zone on the inside, the wind curves down into the low pressure zone. And the fact that that pressure is so low there is inviting like something to come into it. Whereas if you have not a wall, something that's more porous than a wall, so you've got some wind pressure making its way through the shelter belt or through the broad environment, you've got trees broadly in the environment, but not very much, then one, for a start, there's not the high speed of the wind coming over the top of the wall, and two, when that wind does come over and into the more sheltered space, there's a slightly higher pressure environment there in the first place. So you just have lower speeds in that place. Does that kind of broadly answer your question, Doug? Or
yeah, it does. It's still counterintuitive to me, I'm sorry, but yeah, no, I can understand where you're coming from. I just always thought of that low pressure system as being able to retain more of that pleasant environment. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
I think it might have to do with porosity levels. So a sailboat is going to be very little porosity, so you maximize that low pressure and the thrust moving forward, right, Doug?
True.
And a shelter belt with too many trees, like too higher stem density, is going to be more similar to a sail. You don't want cleared because then it's moving at wind speed, but 20 to 30% canopy cover equivalent in stems slows the wind speed, but prevents that porosity from becoming sail-like, where it just causes turbulence on the backside, I think. That's my
Okay, so I mean, basically, in view of that, then I mean, just to have the trees there is one thing, but that still allows the wind to come through underneath. So that shrub layer would be quite effective and in achieving that lower wind velocity going through.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that we want to see in a healthy ecosystem is multiple stories. So obviously a no bare ground pasture of native grasses would be ideal, and then moving up into the shrubs. We've got so many that the birds rely on, and pity Dave's gone, and then into the tree level, where our birds and beautiful mammals like koalas and gliders live and stuff like that. So I do think, yeah, as you have shrubs, grasses, and trees, that porosity argument slows down. Slows down the wind. It doesn't slow down the argument. All right, we might get back into co-design. How does that sound? So we've just heard from a lot of people here. Thank you, James. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Dave. What we're now going to invite you to do, everybody is online. If you could go to openwoodlandrestoration.com. Otherwise, I'm going to put it up on screen in a sec. And what we've created is a model your grazing impacts page, which enables us to look at a planting and its potential effects in terms of grazing impact. And what we're after from our collective audience, you guys, is how to improve this page. Do we need bits of content? Do we need to remove, replace, or add things? How do we make this happen? And so I'd invite you all, as we move through on screen, to come off mute, and we are recording this, obviously. And the reason we're recording this is so that we can integrate people's feedback. So I just did the wrong thing by doing that. Meant to do that. And take us over to Open Woodland Restoration. So for those that hadn't been at our earlier co-design sessions, the first one had us work on the home page or the about page and this map our farm page, which ultimately ended up with us creating the capacity for someone to put in their name, email address, and their physical address, and then be able to submit that to get a snapshot. And a snapshot included the ability for them to get their ACCUs for a specific area. So then we were able to do the financial modeling of the resulting carbon forest that is grown if those trees reach 2 meters tall and 20%. And this would enable us or any users who are interested in open woodland restoration to play around with various sensitivities and understand the financial model and when things might happen in practice and how they might impact financial modeling. But further to that, what we came to understand is that there are productivity impacts from open woodland restoration. So for the first 5 years, for example, you're going to have trees establishing, and you want to keep the feral animals, but also your grazing animals off those whilst they're getting to a height where they're no longer supper. And you're foregoing productivity for 3 to 7 years, let's call it 5 years. And that's a loss of carrying capacity, a loss of productive capacity. But after those trees are in the landscape, given the hard data we have and the direct data we have, and given the landscape function data we can observe, but which isn't strong, we have to make decisions about whether having trees in the landscape is going to lead to an improvement in productivity or an impairment in productivity. And that is really the purpose of this grazing impacts calculator. So on the left again will be our assumptions, pardon me, and our sensitivities. And on the right, we will see them expressed. Underneath, we've put some descriptive text to help the user understand how we're looking at grazing only versus with carbon comparisons, or how grazing income over time might change between scenario A and B, how net present value is accounted for, and then basic ideas around a project area will have an area, there'll be income escalation as a result of inflation, for example. And so what we'd like to do here is compare the grazing impacts of a particular project. So we're going to use data on a 30-hectare project area as if it's typical of the Southern Tablelands area. Now, I would ask people to kind of give me an average DSE of an area that they would be looking to do open woodland restoration in. Typically, I would say we have found farmers go for low DSE areas and look to have the trees do a renovation job so that with shade and shelter, they might become a lambing paddock with proper rest and re-establishment. That lambing paddock might have plenty of native grasses that provide, nutrient-rich milk, etc. And so the DSE at the start might be 5 DSE. If you're particularly productive, might be 8.5 DSE per hectare. If your pasture improved, you might be at a different level. So that's the purpose of that figure. And I guess the question I have for you all, is that clear? Is that a fair scale, DSE? Is that the productive equivalent that people are using, or would you prefer
What,
AE? Oh,
Woody,
sorry.
I'd love to get Hansie's view on this, given that you spoke. No, you spoke to the fact that you're comparing your product, your outcome to someone who are cocky, and they might have 5,000 head, but they've got lower profitability, right? So you've got lower head, but higher gross margin effectively. And so how do you capture that in the sense of what are the metrics that you think about when you're actually trying to understand that relative performance?
I'm no scientist, and my husband is just an old-fashioned farmer that didn't fit in and went his own way. So I can't give you any specific measurements we did. He doesn't particularly keep good records. So I can't help you on that side. It's people that do those sort of things, and the young people that'll come up and use all these graphs and all the rest of it. We can only go from our gut feeling. And I can say to you that when we took the place back over, we had 5,000 odd sheep running and the place was bare. We cut that right back to 3,000. And within 3 years, we were doing as many bales of our lesser numbers of wool than we were doing of the 5,000 sheep. So for me, doing the books for my husband and helping him open gates and so forth, as all good farmers' wives do, I can only speak from experience, what I've seen and the book work I've done. And he spends less. We haven't bought superphosphate for 25 years, and our paddocks are more productive and greener now than what they've ever been. So it's all in instinctively by my husband, and I can only confirm that the end result is a much easier, happier life. He still works just as hard, not that he needs to, and with a lot less expenditure. And as far as diesel and fertilizer costs and all the rest of it, it's not a problem because nature, he's able to get nature to do it for him. And I think that's the way with allowing those native grasses, especially in those beautiful boxland paddocks that we have, allowing nature to do its own thing and just working with it. So I can't give you scientific stuff. That's why I came on just to sit in and listen.
No, it is brilliant. Because that's your experience would be similar to someone like Christoph Burr, who's on our board, but he's a cattle farmer in Queensland and spends nothing on looking after his cattle, but is very environmentally kind of, I suppose, low input kind of managing his property. He's very careful about his trees, but trying to bottle what you've done and find a way to communicate that to others is part of what
that's the issue. It's very hard to do, especially when you do not have the ability to verbalize things in as good a manner as all the speakers have this morning. Totally agree with everything that was said, and I know it works. That's the only info I can give you.
Yeah.
So, it becomes very frustrating. Gary comes out of a very typical Yass grazier family. There's heaps of them up around here. And there's lots of families around Yass that have worked the same way for 3-4 generations, and Gary's 6th generation. And we lived up in Tumut for 38 years. And when we came back and looked at the original farm, we thought, oh my God, it looks tired. It looks so worn out. And that's what we did. And it's many, many years ago. And it's worked for us. So it's gut feeling, or it's instinctive, or whatever you want to call it.
So it feels like we need to connect Wardy out, because we're coming at it from a gross margin. It's a kind of a mechanical way of doing it. We need to connect that with your lived experience in some way.
Well, that's exactly right. If you could get that, the ability of the information and technology that the young people can have got now, there's such an opportunity if that connection between the older generation and if that could be brought together, because there has to be a certain amount of instinct. It can't just be done by figures. That's a whole different discussion, I think, Andrew. You didn't want to go there.
No, I do. I think that what's fascinating to me is that it's such a good case for low input agriculture and biomimicry and working with nature, and that there's gross margin in that, right? And that there's a resilience that comes from being a low cost producer when we've got volatility in fertilizer and fuel, and we've got no individual control as farmers as to what we receive for our animals. We're sort of at the winds for that. The thing we do have control over is the cost of production. And so I think what your husband and yourself have obviously done is take control over the things you can control, which may well be needing to be part of the Open Woodlands Restoration story. In terms of the grazing impact story, when you're at home on the farm, are you using DSC or animal equivalent, or what's the language you use?
Yeah, Gary uses DSC.
DSC. And do you have a rough feel for and I could ask anybody here for their I might actually, Camilla, if you're familiar, Camilla's with Tablelands Farming Systems Group.
Right.
Southern Tablelands, Camilla, what would be a typical unimproved, so native grass paddock? Would that be close to 5 DSE, higher, lower in your expectation?
Yeah, no, I would probably estimate, 5 to 6 DSE. Yep.
And if we were looking at gross margin today of per DSE, so you sell, mate, do you feel that it's closer to $60 historical level, or is it higher or lower given the prices we're seeing in the yards? And if you don't feel you can answer, you can defer and we'll go. But
yeah, I may defer, but I would probably estimate it would be slightly higher based on current prices. Sort of at record highs. But I probably wouldn't hazard a guess, but I can definitely get back to you, Audie.
Okay, cool. And who's got a crystal ball? But for the sake of this impact calculator, we'll probably need to escalate at a rate. Now you can, kind of make it sort of the inflation rate of 2.5% and justify your assumption. How long would it take for the trees to establish is usually a function of rainfall. Anywhere, over 600 mils, and you're likely to get establishment, but there's a relationship with altitude. So somewhere up near Braidwood, it's sort of towards 7 years until those trees get to 2 meters tall. Whereas I have seen trees that are 18 months old at 2 meters tall. For Doug, I know your property. How long does it take for you to get a tree to 2 meters tall?
Well, I've done some tree planting now on the ridges, and they were done 2.5 years ago, and I'd say they're about 1.5. The good ones are at 1.5 meters.
So to get to 2 meters tall, what are you reckoning? 4 or 5 meters of 4 or 5 years of exclusion?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but this is ridges, bare ridges.
Yeah.
So it's probably a harsher environment and a bit slower for them to get up there.
All right. Well, why don't we say the establishment takes longer rather than less time? And we're going to assume, that there's just excluded from that 30 hectares while the trees are being established, that there's 0 DSE, even though the interrows could potentially be electric taped, or if halter or the equivalent technologies were there and you could keep the sheep or cattle out of it, you could potentially graze. but let's assume there's no grazing during the establishment. The big question then becomes, after establishment, would you expect to have an increase or a decrease in the DSE per hectare? Now, I want to sort of show you what happens and the sensitivity in these boxes. If I assume a reduced DSE, the project takes a very flat trajectory. If the DSE is improved, well, then the trajectory is quite good. And so it's a decision that no doubt if you're seeking finance, seeking the younger generation's involvement, because trees are 25-year kind of project, you want to make sure the succession and everybody is on board with this sort of thing. This becomes a very critical estimation or assumption that you put into your financial model. And of course, is there going to be record prices like we're experiencing today after establishment, or might they go more towards the mean over the last few years? Or is protein going to be more and more valuable the further we go out? These, again, are going to be critical decisions to make. Now, what you want to do for your carbon project so that you can compare with and without a carbon project, I have to tell you, it's just started storming where I am here. I don't know if you can hear the rain in the background, but I can barely hear myself. Rowan, I'm going to move locations. Can I get you to take control of this? And I'm going to move into my office.
We can hear you, Audie, by the way.
I can hardly hear myself.
All right. I've got it open. We can go to the...
Sounds like Wardy's the lucky one who's getting the rain.
He's he's complaining. Can you believe it? Just on that, the gross margin, it's not just about obviously the price you get on your sales. It's also on the costs. So as Hansi was saying, if you're reducing your costs because you're reducing your inputs, then that's increasing your gross margin. So understanding what the gross margin is both a revenue and an expense kind of item. So what we're doing there is we're going, right, okay, what's the your current projected kind of earnings? Let's compare that to a situation where we strip out grazing for a period of time and then model what the grazing income will be after trees are established. And then we go, well, okay, and then what's the value? This bit's designed to calculate in a very kind of simplified form, what's the value of the carbon project? So what we're saying here is you're going to, instead of just continuing grazing business as usual, you're going to plant trees, exclude them for a period of time, and then you're going to have revenue from carbon credits. And so what this seeks to do is you've got a project of a certain size, in this case 30 hectares. It assumes you've run that through Planner, which is this online tool, and if you're using our going through our process here, you will have that number from your first step in that process where you map your farm. And so you get this, we'll give you this number from Planner, which is the number of ACCUs that you can expect to receive over the course of a carbon project. And now we're going to actually model what's the potential revenue on that and what are the expenses associated with that. So the revenues is driven by clearly the price of ACCUs that you can expect to receive across the course of the project life, 25 years. That's you need to kind of consider what the world's going to look like over 25 years. It's relatively hard to do, but like the current price is in and around currently $35. So what we can do is to say, well, the current price is this. Does it go up? Does it go down? It's less likely to go down given the current regulatory arrangements where major polluters are required to increasingly buy ACCUs in order to offset their emissions. So think of the gas and oil companies in particular. and coal companies. They're required to buy ACCUs under the current safeguard mechanism, and there's effectively projected a shortfall out past 2030, 2035. So there's some expectation that'll and real expectation that'll underpin prices. But in any event, we need to make some assumptions with respect to price. And then what we're looking to do is to also understand how we go about financing these upfront costs. So when you undertake a project, there's costs associated with planting trees, and this is one of the things that we think that the government needs to look at pretty seriously, is in supporting farmers. If the government is serious in wanting farmers to do these projects, it's finding ways to support farmers to actually fund these projects, because as it currently stands, if you're going to undertake a carbon project, you bear all the costs up front. You bear all the risks with respect to do the trees grow. You bear the risk with respect to carbon prices, and then you get paid back over like years, 10 to 25 through carbon credits. And we think that's a pretty, and we understand others do too, it's a pretty difficult proposition for a lot of farmers. So we're looking at ways of to debt finance those upfront costs in ways that are more farmer friendly, if you like. So that's what this is looking at, saying, well, can you debt finance the upfront costs? And we're hoping the government will step in and kind of agree to some sort of HEX loan type arrangement equivalent to enable that financing. But that's what that relates to. And then we're assuming there's costs that are built into this model. If you're looking at model financial impacts, you can get a better sense of how they're broken down. And there's assumptions underneath that you can have a look at. So, Wardy, did you want to kind of take back control and talk us through the...
Well, yeah, the first thing is, and I think we might have uncovered it when you had the discussion with Hansi. What if you're a farmer or a landholder arriving at this page, wanting to understand the grazing impacts? What is there or what isn't there that should be there? What do we need to add? And maybe Hansi put her fingers on it. It's not just the revenue, it's the cost of production. But I feel that might be farm level financing rather than the project of open woodland restoration. But it does raise, the option for us to put content around costs of production open and being a low input producer and the benefits of that. Has anybody else got other things? And Rowan, I'll invite you to stop sharing so that we can go to a gallery view. Has anybody else got comments they'd like to bring in with respect to what should be on the calculator? What's missing? What would you like to see? What information would help you make an informed decision?
I guess when you change the DSEs before and after establishment, maybe some resources around what you could expect of, how many less you'd have to account for, how many more you can account for based on that environment that you sort of, I guess, provided.
Would things like a calculator with relationship to, well, James just showed average temperature, wetness, altitude have a relationship. So if somebody in Map My Farm also gives us their altitude as a result of that, and we can look up the temperature, would model grazing impacts within DSE post-establishment? Would you be able to compare a no tree or cleared environment to a treed environment? And would that be part of the calculator you'd like to see?
Yeah, I guess it would maybe be just looking at that particular farm through the snapshot, for example. Maybe that gives a bit of a better input on that particular property. So it might not be that you can really include that in there as a standard calculation. But yeah, I guess that's if you run a model, like what can you expect for that particular property in terms of DSEs once trees are established, to sort of run that number. But I guess if you can get that information on a more farm level through the snapshot, for example, or feasibility report, and you can include that in there just so it gives you a bit of an idea of what number to plug, I guess, and put in there. Yeah.
What information would help a farmer to know whether DSE is going to be impaired or improved as a result of trees in the landscape? And is this calculator doing the job, or is it making it complex but not clear? I need a what's it called? A devil's advocate. I'm going to call on an actual advocate. Russell, you're a lawyer. What's wrong with this site? What makes it hard for someone to use?
I think the text or the headings need to be bigger. I'm looking at a big screen and it's all quite condensed. I appreciate there's a lot of information and inputs, so it's quite a complex process. So, I mean, fantastic for building it behind the scenes, but I just wonder sort of readability or usability could be improved. I'm having a bit of trouble working out, sort of coming from a financing background, I'm having a bit of trouble working out whether the impact of leverage, which I expected should be much greater in some of the scenarios I'm whittling, doesn't seem to be working out to the benefit of the farmer or the grower as much as I was expecting. And I can talk to you later about this, but I'm not sure the NPV with the carbon project is working out as I was expecting. And I have looked at this before, but just playing around with it now, yeah, I'm not sure whether it's meeting my sort of common sense tests. So maybe other people have had some feedback or are able to comment on that.
Maybe you should be specific here, Russell, because you're kind of you're asking whether the model is correct, and so we need to know specifically. I mean, it's probably if it is.
So in the bottom left-hand corner, you end up with an NPV breakdown, and you can, depending on where you set the ACCU price, I can get that to become, well, the green and the blue parts can swap around and end up going negative. In terms of how that's presented, you're still ending up with an overall positive NPV. I'm just wondering whether that's the best way to present it.
Mm-hmm. So this sliding scale, is that what you mean?
Yeah. So if you take the ACCU base price down to 20 or something.
Yeah, it goes underneath and that goes out and up. Okay.
Even though the whole project is still sort of positive cash flow basis. I just wonder whether that is, I don't know. Is it the colors that are causing that, or I'm not sure.
Good question, though. Very good question.
I guess that if and this is sort of back to what Hansi was saying, if you're not sort of already managing or have a, in your mind your own view of what all of these assumptions are, is there a way that we can point to where you can get them from, or get some more research for your own scenario about them?
Maybe a resources page. James, you've got your hand up and are a great resource for this. So
yeah, look, it's a great challenge, this question, because the better quality data you put into any thing that's modeling what's going to happen in the future, the better the prediction is. But also, there's a certain amount of time you can spend on it before you want to do something else. So I always like, can we add this bit and can we add that bit? And then we end up with a point where we sort of decrease how usable it is. So the thing that was coming to my mind was I would expect a lot hinges on what do we expect the paddock to support in terms of dry sheep equivalents after the treatment. And the way I was thinking about it, like, it's probably going to increase over time. So we have got kind of a flat whatever I say is after treatment. If I say after treatment is 8 years, then the DSC after 8 years just applies, I think, consistently for that whole year. Whereas really what I think would be likely to happen is it would increase for a bit, and then the level of increase would tail off. Because it's a little bit of speculation about what it's going to be. Some questions, if a landholder wanted to answer, say, 3 questions or 4 questions, it might give them an understanding of how much they expect their paddocks will be improved. So some of those questions could be like, how many paddocks do I have with good shelter at the moment? What is the critical time for me for my livestock production enterprise, which might be lambing if you have a sheep enterprise, which is September, October. And then what are the weather conditions like? Do I have cold winds in September? And then that could give an indication of the likely benefit. It's a bit of a slippery slope, because once you start thinking about it, you want to answer all the questions. And as Mira was saying, we kind of need to look at it at a property level with a map to get decent answers. But these are the kinds of questions that were in my head.
And I think they're brilliant. Thank goodness we're recording all this, because that was great stuff.
Can I just sorry,
bear in mind the time, mate.
Yeah. No, but I'm just thinking about this Hansie's response and then Russell's response. And one of the questions I've got then is who's the user of this calculator? Because my guess is, based on what Hansie said, that she's not particularly, she doesn't really want be trying to work out DSE numbers, for example, and then listening to Russell. So Russell, in answer to your question, why does the carbon go negative in the NPV? And that's because the carbon project, at a carbon price of 15 or under $20, the carbon project is losing money over the course of its life. So it's got a negative NPV. But your point is your question's kind of well made. It's like, well, this is complicated, and I'm trying to work out what these numbers are. And it points to the fact of who's using this calculator. Is it an advisor that's working with a farmer who can kind of interpret the numbers? Or are we trying to pitch it at the point of going, well, this is for a farmer to try and get a sense of what this looks like?
There might be 2 tracks you could take. Someone do it yourself versus, have someone help you complete this.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, guys, this is the pointy end of the day. Please pull out your phones again. Pardon me. And click on the QR code in front of you. Otherwise, I am also going to bring up the link and paste it in the chat. But those with your phones, please do your QR codes now.
Drum roll, Woody, drum roll.
You actually need the link still, don't you, guys?
No.
There you go.
Hey.
All right. Yeah, Stephen, sorry, it's coming now. If you look on the chat, it'll be there. Now, you're lucky you're going to get a full 5 minutes to complete this survey. We want you to consider your answers, please. While you're filling in that survey, I might just give you some of the feedback from the first survey. Ignore what I say and keep answering your questions as you go along, but I found it interesting myself to see that we had 15 responses at the beginning to who was in the room, and of those, 47% are farmers. We, beyond that, have a government and other as 13% each, and then advisors 26%. Most people are here to understand more about open woodland restoration. Yeah, great. What people wanted out of this, observer to share and learn, want to be a project partner, want to hear what others think about productivity and on-farm woodlands, looking at what is happening, just gathering information to find out about the project, to understand the financials of how to get improved productivity, to keep getting updated about the program, to observe others and their experiences, to hear more about opportunities, to hear more about opportunities. We still have a fair bit of woodland and would like to improve our open areas. I'm interested in the benefit of trees on farmland, having vegetation restoration already. I'm interested in getting further information about carbon projects. I'll give you another minute, guys. If you can, please do some completing. Also looking at the responses that are starting to come in from you all. Not unsurprisingly, people found productivity benefits or financial benefits to be what we should lead with in terms of our story. People trust tablelands, local land services, farmers. What information is missing? Need to emphasize gross margins. The challenge is finding out and then making sense of it. Great feedback. Thank you very much, everybody. All right. So we've got a minute to spare. You're on the final leg, guys. Thank you so much for sticking in there. What I wanted to just finish with is thank yous and providing mechanisms for support over the next 2 years. So we have, thanks to the New South Wales government, panels, an advisor panel, a technical panel, and a markets panel that we will be putting together, plus additional resources for this website. Particularly between now and June 30, we would welcome any farmers to come to openwoodlandsrestoration.com and get their farm mapped for free and get a farm level feasibility. We are going to incorporate the feedback on this calculator along with the financial calculator to continue to systematicize open woodland restoration. This is the end of 4 events for the Environmental Market Participation Initiative, and a farm visit that we held on Monday earlier this week. We will be having further events throughout the years, and we would encourage you to return to openwoodlandrestoration.com to see those. And just as the last, one of the key conclusions that we've come to understand from this is that the biggest barriers to adoption of open woodland restoration remain that financial gap between when the investment is required in design, land preparation, fencing, tree planting, and the payoff, which is often 7 to 10 years away. That gap is unreasonable for small farmers to be expected to cover. And until the government provides a carbon-backed loan to enable farmers to offset those upfront costs, we don't believe that uptake will be high. And CER complexity. It is very intimidating for farmers to see governments of different stripes threatening to undo different mechanisms whilst they're considering 25-year projects. And so there is a real anxiety for farmers to enter into the carbon market and engage in reforestation, a very tangible example of sequestration, whilst there's regulatory risk and complexity there. All right, so as Regen Farmers Mutual, we'd like to thank you all for attending and for co-designing and for the support that you've given us over the last few years. To our speakers today, thank you, Rowan, for covering me when I had the rain. Thank you, Sue, for your expert advice and input. Thank you, James, and to David Smith, who's not with us right now. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Woody.
Woody. Bye.